Hello, and welcome back to The Next Big Thing. My name is Chris Gennady, Global Head of Research at Wisdom Tree. Today, I am fortunate Mobeen Tahir is back. I know he joins me quite often, Director at Wisdom Tree. Mobeen and I talk a lot to investors around the world on different thematic strategies and topics. And today's episode is particularly exciting because we are joined by Ben Taylor, CFO and Chief Strategy Officer at Exscientia, which is, just for full disclosure purposes, it is actually a company that is included in the Wisdom Tree global AI strategies. We're not here necessarily to talk about those today, but just wanted to disclose up front that we do hold Exscientia as a position in our portfolios. Before we begin, I do need to state the following to clarify: the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of Wisdom Tree and Exscientia and are subject to change. Anything we present in this podcast is not intended to be relied upon as a forecast, research, nor as investment or tax advice. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast are not a recommendation, offer, or solicitation to buy or sell any securities, and reliance upon them is at the sole discretion of the listener. Please remember, past performance is no indication of future results. And so, with that out of the way, we can now welcome Ben to the podcast. And Ben, something I think would be helpful to kind of understand is, there's obviously a certain path that you took, a certain journey that you took that has evolved and gotten us to where we are today all together. And I would love to hear, and I'm sure our audience would love to hear, a bit more of your background, some of the key events, as well as the background of Exscientia, which obviously was a company and an idea at a certain point. I'm always fascinated by sort of the origin stories of some of these things, remembering that NVIDIA wasn't always the giant 2 trillion AI company. There were some guys in a cafeteria somewhere in Northern California back in the early 90s thinking about graphics video cards. And, there's always a story, there's always an evolution. And I, for one, am always particularly interested to learn as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me, Chris and Mobeen. Really a pleasure. I guess you could say my journey here started in investment banking, but really it was before that. I never intended to be in investment banking to start with. I just had a lot of student debt, and so needed a job that paid well, and had heard about this investment banking thing. I ended up going into it for about 15 years and worked in healthcare investment banking. Most of that was with Goldman, but it's interesting. I didn't trade stocks. I was in an advisory role. So I spent almost all of that time working with executives across the industry, mostly all in biopharma, and learning what was working and what wasn't working. And it was a great place to understand all of the problems of the industry and where things were breaking down. But I got to a point where I was working with a lot of successful financially companies. So a lot of companies that were driving a great return or got to a certain point and were acquired. But I actually wasn't seeing a lot of change for patient outcomes. There weren't actually a lot of medicines that were getting across the line. And so I've always believed if you see a problem, you can either try and do something about it or you can accept it. This is one that I wanted to be a part of making better. So I jumped over to the corporate side. I've been in executive management for about 10 years. I ran the day-to-day operations at an oncology biotech for 4 years, literally getting in there, helping design clinical trials, doing manufacturing builds, working with the regulators and patient advocacy groups, and learned firsthand how hard it is to get a drug approved. And that actually led me over to Exscientia, where what we're really trying to do is change the probability of success on developing drugs, because about a little over 95% of drugs fail. And so if you think about that, whether you're an investor or you're a manager, you can't make a good rational decision if 95% of the time it's going to fail. And so you have to get in there and you actually have to change those inputs in the model to actually make better decisions. And so that's what got me here.
And Ben, I'd love to hear more about Exscientia and sort of, I mean, it sounds like the mission itself, based on the initial description, makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah.
Some of us listening have probably heard of Arum's law, which is sort of the opposite of Moore's law. You just
Yeah.
spell it backwards and you say, the chip world has sort of been doubling in its efficiency every 18 to 24 months, roughly speaking. Maybe that continues, maybe not. And the drug development and discovery world has been getting more expensive and more inefficient, seemingly, by leaps and bounds. And so it's curious to just know, like, what was that year like? People somewhere are getting together and coming up with the initial idea that becomes the company. Because sometimes we have the mistaken impression, we're talking in 2024, the company was formed like a couple years ago, and frequently that's not true. Frequently the journey could be 10 years, could be longer, and it would just be interesting to hear as we start getting set up here, when the company began and when those ideas were taking their formulation.
Yeah, so the founders of the company wrote some of the seminal papers back in the 2000s of how you might use AI to actually choose better designs of drugs and explore the drug space more completely because it is a beyond massive multi-parameter problem. So first of all, the chemical space. If you look at possible medicinal drugs, you're talking about 10 to the 60th different possible combinations. So just far beyond imagining. At the same time, we always think about, oh, I'm going after this target. I want a certain drug to hit this target. But that's not how biology works. If we give a patient a drug, we're not actually directly connecting a drug to that target. It has to go through all of their biology. You're unleashing this drug inside of their body and all of the different possible interactions that it could have. And so you have to start thinking about how is this going to interact with all of the different proteins, not just the one that I want it to hit. And how is this body going to, or how is the drug going to be absorbed in all of those different pieces? And so um, where the company started was I'm going to use AI to explore the chemical space and make better decisions about which chemistries I'm going to use. And it went into the academic setting for a while. And then in 2012, it was actually spun out of the University of Dundee. And that really started the foundations of it. Um, since then, the company has really built up because what you want to be able to do is not only create a system for generating possible drug candidates virtually. So we've got a couple of different generative AI systems that we use to explore the drug space. Then we've got literally thousands of different modeling systems for how we evaluate it. And then we've got another aspect, which is really how you select the right molecules. But that entire loop has had to evolve as we expand to be able to cover more and more of those potential multi-parameter problems that you go through. So what you actually want to do is think about all the reasons a drug might fail in the future and then create a predictive model for how you can say, how you can predict that your drug won't fail in that way, and then use that at the very beginning of the process. Because let me just take you on a little bit of a journey in drugs. So right now, it's about a 10 to 15 year process and costs about $2 to $3 billion to get a drug across the line. However, as soon as you choose the chemistry for a drug, its entire future is determined. We're just exploring the different properties of it when we take it through clinical testing. We actually don't change the drug at all. So what you want to be able to do is predict all of those things and incorporate it into your design of the drug at the very beginning. And that's what medicinal chemistry tries to do. So the reason AI is so well suited for it is AI does multi-parameter optimization really, really well. And in the human driven process, it's sequential. You solve one problem at a time, which is why we've got drugs that can do what's called potency very well. They can attack a target, but they're often not safe or they have other drug interactions. It's because in the human process, you start with potency and then you work your way down all of the different aspects. In an AI based system, we can actually look at it as a multi parameter problem that we're optimizing for. And so that's been the journey of the company, is starting with the generative AI systems back more than a decade ago. And since then, building all sorts of different modeling systems so that we can predict those drug properties better. And from the beginning, design them to be successful.
And and Ben, you said something that I picked up on. I think our audience is going to pick up. Before I bring Mobeen into the discussion, it sounded like you indicated you were focused on and using generative AI roughly for a decade, and the world at large, Mobeen and I included, were not talking about generative AI until November of 2022 when ChatGPT comes out, and in a way that's sort of what wakes the rest of us up to generative AI. So I'm just curious, in the pre ChatGPT world, when you're saying generative AI, what type of models was Exscientia bringing to bear before the rest of the world really woke up to a lot of this stuff?
Yeah, well, it was a mixture of different models, but our earliest systems were evolutionary learning, but then we moved pretty quickly to reinforcement learning approaches. And we can use a mixture of the two as well. But it's really about how do you explore the chemical space more efficiently. And so, what our systems were set up to do is virtually generate novel chemistry, but to do it in a way that's targeted. Remember, I said it's 10 to the 60th of the possible chemical combinations, but you actually have to make systems that, or you have to actually make drugs that are going to be manufacturable, that can be absorbed by the body, that won't have certain interactions. And so, what you actually want to do is create a generative system that will generate novel chemistry. Not this is not a this is not a screening platform. This is a generative platform. And so you want to be able to go into new space, but have them focus on drugs that are already optimized for a lot of those things that you're going to need to be able to develop and commercialize it. And so that's where the company started using it for. And it was funny because when the Chat GPT moment came out, obviously what OpenAI did is an amazing feat. But it was sort of like, well, of course you'd want a system that's going to do that. This is going to be fundamentally transformational, because what you're doing is you're introducing um, creativity into what you can do computationally. And that is so incredibly powerful. And that's what we were using it for in the chemistry space. Rather than have somebody draw out their ideas of what a good chemistry might do, we were literally generating it virtually and then having the AI select which molecules we would test and make.
So I do want to bring Mobeen now into the discussion. Mobeen, take it away.
Ben, I would love for you to give us your sense of how Exscientia's approach contrasts with how we typically understand the pharma industry traditionally, in the sense that what I gather from you is, and of course everything that is on Exscientia's website, this idea that we're moving from generalized sort of healthcare to more personalized, generative AI tools being used and so forth. And now we know that traditionally the pharma industry has always worked on a model where there's years of R&D. Typically, you get a drug at the end. Maybe there's a patent, and that makes the whole endeavor worthwhile. With more precision medicine type pursuits, you aren't necessarily selling one drug to the masses because you're looking to do something a bit more tailored to the individual. Um, so, give us a sense for how the average person can understand what the final product is like for a company like Exscientia, and or will it be in the future, and how that compares, especially how do the economics compare to a traditional pharma company?
Yeah, of course. So I think it's really important. We use precision medicine a little bit differently than it's traditionally been used, and that's because of what we're able to address with our technology. So classically, precision medicine has been, I've got a single gene that is mutated to a certain way, or I'm a very specific patient population. But what we want to do is actually use it to just better understand the problem and then design a drug that is precisely for that problem. Because if you think about it, most drugs on the market, let's take oncology, for example, a successful clinical trial in cancer typically is only effective in about 30% of patients. That means there's 70% of patients that aren't getting that same benefit of that 30% that are. And so what we try and do is from the very beginning, understand which patient population are we going after? How can we actually design a drug that is going to either be targeted for that 30% specifically and just know from the beginning, we're not going to try and target the other 70%, or how can we design a drug that will be effective for all 100%? And you really have to get deep into the biology. You have to get deep into the understanding of the drug. There's lots of technical reasons why people don't try and do that today. But I think that's an area where what we're doing with our chemistry approaches, as well as some of the other companies with their biology approaches, you really start to break that down. You better understand what the patient need is, and then you can design a better drug for it.
In the world of AI, Ben, like any other industry, there are, of course, interdependencies. Sometimes it's useful to think in terms of a value chain.
Yeah.
Even a company like NVIDIA, as Chris was mentioning earlier, it's become a behemoth in the AI world, but it doesn't operate on its own in isolation. It relies on other companies like TSMC for fabrication, which in turn relies on companies like ASML for those machines that do extreme UV lithography and so forth. In Exscientia's ecosystem, what other parts are there of significance which allow Exscientia to do all the things that it does, whether it's the tools that you're using or the things that go into manufacturing all the products? So give us a sense of where Exscientia sits in the broader ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. So the best way to think about us is we create the predictive systems for a small molecule drug. So a small molecule drug is basically, you can think of it as things that you would take by mouth, drugs you would take by mouth rather than getting an injection or something else. And so what we do is we create both the generative AI and the predictive systems around how is that going to work. So if you went with your NVIDIA example, they are designing their GPUs, but then they have to test it in a simulated environment, right? Before you send it to fabrication, before any users get a hold of it, you actually need to do the design, and then you need to simulate it in a virtual environment to understand, did I get this design right? Before, I think I heard Jensen say it's a $500 million button every time he hits the button on a new fabrication. And so, like, before he hits that button, you need to be sure that you've got it right. So in a similar way, we're focused on how do I design something and then test it virtually every way possible to understand if it's right. Now, what we actually found is because biology is so complex, because chemistry is so complex, you can't do it all virtually. You literally have to do experimental process around it because we are not a big data problem. We're a sparse data problem. And so that means it's not about creating a large amount of proprietary data and then sorting through it. It's actually about creating proprietary data that is answering a specific question because the data that you want, that we want, does not exist. And so that was the other part that the company grew into. Originally, it was all simulations and virtual. But then about 7 years ago, we started doing our own experimental work as well. Basically, the way I like to think about it is we had to know what good looked like. if our AI is the best question and answer system for, I'm asking a question of a certain drug I want and it's giving me the best answer, I still need to know what that question is that I want to have answered. And that's where the experimental component comes in. So we do a lot of our own internal testing around that. And we actually just opened up an automation facility that gets us closer to autonomous drug design and allowing us to do a very tight loop. But that's the aspect that we play in. We are not as focused on the original target identification. There's some companies doing some really fantastic work in understanding biology in a different way. And we have focused operations in oncology drug development, so running cancer clinical trials. But actually, we partner out a lot of the drugs that we design to other companies that want to develop them. The Sanofis of the world, the Merck KGaAs, Bristol Myers, who have the capabilities of running many clinical trials and doing that very expensive part. So that would be like the downstream clients in the NVIDIA example. I suppose AWS and others running their chips. Our core focus is definitely on that design, simulation, and very precise experimentation. And then the before and after, I think, are partnered out in our system.
And Ben, something that has been fascinating to consider as we all sort of learn more and more about AI and think about how these systems ultimately work. A lot of ink gets spent in the virtual world writing articles about how whether it's Gemini, whether it's the GPT-4 with the little zero after it, recognizing that some of these models are getting close to or possibly even exceeding 1 trillion parameters, and thinking about how much data you need to run through such a model so that it's a meaningful enough amount to take advantage of the size of the model. And it gets widely discussed, even using the entire corpus of the internet may not necessarily be enough. But what we're discussing here is obviously a much more specialized problem. We don't need the output to be, a nice little limerick or a play or some text. We need the output specific to the chemistry world. And I would just be curious to hear a bit more about, say, the evolution of the type of data, to the extent we can make it tangible to the audience, because of course the training data for a lot of these systems, that's really everything. That's really the fuel. If the training data is not good, you imagine everything else is going to be bad. So in a way, if you, from the outside looking in, were really excited about the training data that a particular company had, in theory, you would be really excited about the prospects of what that company could do in AI. But I fully admit, thinking about the type of data you might use for, chemistry applications, I pretty much have no idea. Like, I'm not sure if you can, for instance, take advantage of, say, every academic article ever written on relevant topics. Can the system, in theory, take in that information as well as other types of rules of chemistry and things of that nature to build something relevant, so that you can get to the point where the system is suggesting those creative outputs that you allude to?
Well, here's the funny part. We can, and we do, access all of the information that we can. It's just honestly not that helpful in most situations, because you're talking about so many different parameters, and the existing data is often heavily biased and poorly annotated. So you're dealing with a massive data interpretation rule. Your correlations and hallucinations are off the charts. And so what we actually do is something where every position of every atom can make a difference. You can change the profile of your drug by changing one atom. And so you can't do that in a generalized system. You actually need very specific data. And so this is where we turn the use of AI a bit on its head. We are absolutely not a big data company. We're not a screening company. We do have AI applications that do deep learning, and we do some LLM work. But if I actually think about where it makes a difference, it's how do you learn as fast as possible? And to illustrate what I mean, if you're familiar with the game 20 questions, so 600,000 words in the English language. If you have 20,000 guesses, you've got a 3% chance of guessing the right word. However, if you ask 20 perfect questions, i.e., a perfect question is something that divides the remainder in half, then you will get the right answer every single time. And so what we do is not that first one of create a lot of data and screen through 20,000 words and hope you get hope it's in the 3%. What we actually do is systems that almost always the predictive value of the model at the beginning is poor because the data doesn't exist. And so we actually have to create a system that is going to rapidly focus in and answer the questions. And so this is where we use a couple of different things. First of all, the generative systems are set up to create properly drug-like molecules. So drugs that are already partially optimized. But then we've got literally thousands of overlapping modeling systems that will predict different qualities in that drug. And we can prioritize those for, say, this indication we want this group, and this indication we want this group to be the most priority models that we're focusing on. But then what we do is actually there's a last step. It's called active learning that we integrate in. And this is where we take chemistry and we make it into data science. So by doing it, we say you can make this chemistry or this chemistry, but you should make this one because you're going to learn more. You're going to reinforce your models better by learning this one. And this is actually one of the problems in traditional chemistry and with screening approaches. You have a tendency to make drugs that are very similar to each other because they score well. But what you actually want to do is make chemistries that are very different from each other so that you can inform your decisions and your models better. And then we can just make a handful of them, test them, and feed that data back into the system and improve the models that way. So this is a very, very different use than you're used to in most of the sets. So we do love data. We love all data. But most of the time, it's actually not going to get us to the right answer. We actually need to create a really tight learning loop that will get us there. And we've done it over and over again, right? We've had 8 or 9 different development candidates. These are not intangible things. These are actual chemistries that you can take into a lab and say, quantitatively, this molecule is better than the other ones that have been created using traditional methods across all of these different parameters. And so we are successfully learning really quickly. I mean, our efficiency rates, during that drug discovery process, we're about 75% faster and cheaper than traditional methods, and we're getting to better outcomes. And that's because we are using this multi-parameter optimization learning loop to go through and find the right chemistry. We're playing 20 questions.
It is fascinating to just think of the history, at least so far, in the sense that human beings, I feel like what we tend to do is we tend to have like our set of biases. We think the answer is going to be sort of in this area, in this domain. And, you think of like the cowpox example where, the people who got cowpox suddenly were immune to smallpox, so a total accident. People thinking about, cholera, the guy recognizing there was a correlation between certain sources of water, people washing their hands before delivering babies versus not. So you have all these sort of historical accidental things that weren't, part of the mainstream that gave us some of our best answers. And it sounds like from your description, the more types of data that might look to the human observer as completely, in all these different areas that maybe a human researcher never would have selected to embark upon. But what the machine can do is come up with possible interesting novel relationships between disparate concepts and ideas. And so one of the interesting things is just like you're saying, that the fact that you're able to get more and more information of value into the
Yeah.
system, such that we might be on. I don't know if you think I'm correct to say this, Ben, but I'd love to get your opinion. We might be on really the very early stage of this journey here, where the more information that's going in that has a value to it, the machine we're probably not even scratching the surface of the relationships that these systems might show us a few years into the future. I don't know if you think that's right.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And that's where our systems have always been called centaur. And that's because there's an aspect of duality to everything that we do. We want to be able to simulate as many possible variables at a time, but there also has to be this physical world reality to it, whether it's a human applying judgment and in setting parameters of where it wants to go, or whether it's a test that is reading out and saying, this is real. This isn't just the experimental aspect. This is what that chemistry is actually doing. And it's a matter of combining those two things together to get to the answer, because this is such a big problem. You can't possibly do it either all on a traditional experimental way with the human driven process, or all on an AI basis, because there's just not the knowledge in either party to be able to do that successfully.
So Ben, recently DeepMind's AlphaFold 3 got a lot of press coverage. It seems like biotech is the sort of space that gets people very excited whenever there's a new breakthrough in the industry. And with AI, perhaps the expectation is that we will see more such breakthroughs in the future. How do you view a development like the AlphaFold 3 being one example announcement, given that it has helped generate more interest in the biotech industry, and inevitably more attention and spotlight will come towards companies like Exscientia and how they are doing maybe slightly different things, but also super important things in the space, even if the press coverage goes to one part of the industry at one point in time, but maybe it shifts in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So the AlphaFold series that they've put out, and AlphaFold 3 being the most recent, they're terrific technologies. Really, I love some of the work that DeepMind is doing, and hope they keep pushing the envelope on some of those aspects. Because what, in essence, they're doing is taking something that is very much experimentally driven right now. People in a lab trying to create proteins and understand it and crystallize them, to something that you can do at least to a decent level virtually. And so that's almost always a good thing, because that takes a lot out of the system where you would waste time or effort in a very manual process to something experimental. And so, I think what we look at it and say, the more of those type of technologies that can be developed, the better. The important part is, how do you then take all of those technologies and put it together into a coherent process to achieve a goal? And so that's where we focus most of our time. We're sort of, think of it as the umbrella. Most all of the technologies that we use were developed in-house, but we're happy to always utilize other technologies as well if they're really transformative. Because what it means is, how do I look at not just the aspects that are, let's use the AlphaFold example. If I can use that to replace a part of the work that I was doing before, let's slot that in. But there are literally, as I was saying before, thousands of different properties that you have to try and figure out. The AlphaFold technologies are going to help you figure out one of them in far greater detail. But I don't just need to know how to bind a drug into a pocket. I need to think about, what's going to happen when I take this pill? How is it going to be absorbed? How long is my body going to keep it in it? What interaction is it going to have with the, 20,000 genes that I have inside of my body, or the other drugs that I'm taking? Or, is this patient have comorbidities, so other diseases that I have to think about? All of those aspects have to be factored in as well. And so it's how do you take all of these different predictive systems, put it together, combine it with a generative system, and then put that into a process that can be done repeatedly and economically to come to a good product. And so we're really excited about all of the technology advancements that are going on right now. I think it's also important. People often ask us about competitors or different aspects like that. We don't think about it that way at all. There are literally hundreds of billions of dollars that are being spent and not producing any results right now. I mean, we're talking about a 95% failure rate. That's because we're using traditional methods that don't predict things very well. And so our competition is not other companies out there. We're all rowing in the same direction. What we want to see is those traditional methods that are wasting hundreds of billions of dollars stop being used, because this is just it's driving better results, and we want to see the adoption across the industry really increase.
So, Ben, whenever we talk about biotech with any of our clients, and you'll be happy to hear this, hopefully, that there is rarely ever a doubt in their minds that this space is an exciting one to look out for. And the reason is, of course, there are very few things as exciting as the promise of tackling challenging health problems and doing it more effectively and at a faster pace than ever before. What could be better? So what would be useful is to just get a sense of Exscientia's pipeline in the sense of what sort of diseases and health conditions and problems is the company looking to tackle. I know you alluded to a few, but it would be good to get a bit more color on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got two different aspects to the company. One is our design platform, so the chemistry portion of the company. And literally that can be applied to any therapeutic space. So we've designed drugs for cancer, for inflammation and immunology fields, for psychiatry, for metabolism. It really doesn't matter because all we need there is to understand what the target is and be able to define what the problem is, and we can design it. And we actually just had word back that we had positive results on one of our immunology drugs that we had partnered out with Bristol Myers, which is great to hear. Good to see those things being successful in the clinic as well. Internally, what we do is really focus on oncology drugs. So, as a smaller company, we need to have focus. And so the ones that we advance ourselves and take through clinical testing are all focused on oncology. We've got one that's currently in phase 1/2 testing. So that's sort of the first half of clinical testing with some initial results that we expect out in the second half of this year. And then we've got two additional ones that are going into the clinic later on this year as well.
Ben, I'm curious in looking at the picture because your initial remarks were sort of saying you start off and you've got a good perspective on how the industry seems to be set up, and in some ways not necessarily set up to get the most throughput, meaning the most potential drugs that could at least have some value for varying percentages of the population through the system, but rather set up to take a lot of time and cost a lot of money. And I'm wondering, as we step back and think about the fact that a drug takes something on the order of 10 years, a billion to 2 billion to ultimately develop, and the failure rate is 95%. If that's sort of our starting point,
Yeah.
what are some ways in which the investment community of say non-experts can start thinking about what's a reasonable expectation, because in some industries, like take finance where Mobeen and I work, in the US, we still launch new strategies based on legislation that was passed in 1933 or 1940, and maybe it's because we did such a great job as a society writing those laws almost 100 years ago. But you could also say it's really, really hard to pass new laws, and regulators kind of get stuck in their ways, and that could be an element to it as well. So I imagine when the world is trying to get drugs approved, we're not necessarily operating in a system that is designed to take full advantage of every new technology that's come into play in, say, the last 10 years. There could be a lot of legacy issues and systems that may just make stuff take longer. And so maybe and some of the stuff that we talk about are maybe instead of taking 10 years, it takes 8 years or 7 years. I mean, none of us necessarily go out and say it could take a year, because that seems too
Yeah.
outlandish, too much of a leap. But just helping people think about setting appropriate expectations in terms of where we might see these technologies going within a reasonable time frame.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's break it down into two different pieces as that are both before a drug reaches the commercial market. So the first part we'll label broadly as discovery. And what that is before you've started any of the human testing. Now, that process is normally 5+ years. It sort of depends on how much time people are experimenting around with the science. But what we've shown is we can take what is typically about a 5-year process and make it about a 2.5-year process. So our portion can be years off of that. And we also showed about a 75-80% reduction in cost of designing that drug and getting your development candidate across the line. So what that enables you to do is actually move science faster, right? So there's a number of companies that are looking at, and I call these sort of the biology 2.0 companies that are going to be focused on how do you define biology better to come up with better ideas for targets. Once you have that idea, so AI can play a massive role in that. And then once you come up with an idea, then we can really make a difference in saying, how do I move an idea into an actual drug candidate, right? And so that's where we come into that process and make it shorter. After that, you go into clinical testing. Now, I'm not going to say that we will change how the FDA looks at clinical testing, for example. However, you have to remember, success in the clinic is not a biology problem. It's a statistical problem. And so the weaker your signal is, the more problems you have with your drugs, the more patients you need in your clinical trial, the longer your clinical trial is, the more expensive it is, because you need to get that statistical powering to show an effect in this diluted clinical population. And so if you actually think about it, we've seen examples of it. When you get the right patients, you can actually expedite that clinical process quite a bit as well. So in patients where there's a particular gene mutation or some of the cell therapies, you don't need thousands of patients to demonstrate effect, because your effect size, your statistical powering, is so strong already. And so the better you are able to design a drug for a specific patient population, actually the faster your clinical trials can be, because you will show effect more dramatically, more quickly, fewer patients, lower cost. And so that's why we think about it as this is all a design problem. Because once you've entered into the clinic, remember, that is all just verifying what you have already designed into a drug. That chemistry is set, it will never change. And so what we try and do is predict all of those reasons something may fail in clinical trials and design them back into that discovery phase. so that you have a better drug coming out of it and you can show a better effect size or a better safety profile or whatever it is we're designing it around. And so AI can actually impact a lot of different aspects without ever needing to change the regulatory process.
That's incredible in the sense that, extrapolating mentally this idea that you're taking the discovery process usually takes 5 years. It might be able to get done, say, on average in 2.5 years. So cutting that part of it in half. And then, like you're saying, doing a better job being more specific and precise such that you can get the results you need on the clinical side. Cutting that down as well, cutting costs down along the way. This is really the hope, and I'm glad we got together today, because this is when Mobeen and I are out in the field. This is kind of the story we hope is being coming together at the various companies in the space, and you've helped us in solidifying. If in terms of, as we recognize we're getting to the end of the time we have together today, what are some of the challenges in your view, say, for the industry, recognizing, you know, uh, innovation is rarely, if ever, in a straight line, and we see our ability to process and take in these massive amounts of data seems to only be going in one direction: up, faster, better, more power, more GPU cycles. I mean, you mentioned Jensen Huang at the beginning here. Those Blackwell chips look pretty incredible, but at the same time, none of this is easy. None of this is a straight line. So as you're sort of coming in today, what are some of the things that, quote unquote, keep you up at night as you sort of think about the possible direction for AI enabled drug discovery as we move forward?
Yeah. Well, and I think overall, I feel like we're in a really good place as an industry. I feel like we are coming out of the trough of disbelief because there's just enough drugs that are advancing through, and we're about to get a lot of clinical data coming from drugs that have been identified or designed with AI. And so we will hopefully have the validation soon that it does make a meaningful difference. I know that the Boston Consulting Group team just did an analysis showing um, normally in phase 1 testing, about half of the drugs fail. What they showed is AI-based drugs had about an 80 or 90% success rate in phase 1. So as you sort of see that play out, I think the validation to the industry comes. Now, where there will be problems is this is a really complex problem that we're dealing with. I mean, a 95% failure rate is not, hey, I'll go out and give it a try and maybe we'll get lucky this time. It's you're expecting failure, right? And so that's not going to go from 95% failure to 100% success overnight. There's going to be a lot of steps in between. So the things that keep me up at night are, let's say you changed it from 95% failure to 50% failure. You've astronomically changed your probability of success and the economics of the industry, but you're still failing half the time. And so, how will it be judged in this early phases where we're just starting to see the actual results start to play out? I think there will be a very large amplification of any news, probably positive or negative, that comes out over the coming couple of years. But I just keep going back to quantitatively, you can go and compare the results that we're getting or others in different aspects that other people do. And they're better results than you're getting out of traditional methods. So I don't know where the exact numbers will end up in terms of probability of success, but they should be better. I also like the idea of more people being able to access the market. So I think there's concern that people don't know where the market's going to go as far as competition and who's going to be the winner. I actually think this is a really big problem where you're not going to see a single winner take all. This is going to be much more like what we have. It's a diversified problem with a lot of different pieces of value to it. I mean, that's the reason why we've got so many large pharma companies. There are different skill sets that everyone needs to bring to bear. And so I think a really important part for any company right now is finding that aspect of where am I going to contribute value? Because I think the problems come if you try and do too many things at once. Because we all see the potential applications. There's a lot of problems to solve. We all need to focus in and say, this is going to be the one that I'm going to solve today. And then tomorrow I'll get another one. And so I think those are the things that keep me up at night. But the fundamentals, where the tech is going, where the modeling systems are going, feels really good. Feels like we're at a nice part in the industry. And one other thing, if I can, just on my as a close, I think we're so overdue for this in biopharma. The economic transformation that we've seen in other markets, if you think about Amazon and retail or Netflix and media, or there's so many other examples, when you change the inputs, you actually can change the entire market, the entire industry. And so if you think about why has pharma been having problems with pricing, with access, with regulatory, it's because the inputs to what they're doing haven't changed. So they have to try and change the output. They have to try and change the price or the number of people that are taking it in order to generate a return. What we want to do is actually change that equation so that the input cost to new science is dramatically less, is fundamentally less. And then all of a sudden, what you see is the entire market changes. You can explore more science. You can figure out different ways to access the right patients. You can take some of the burden off of the government. All of these big concepts need that input change to happen so that you're not forced into this situation at the end of all of the investment, but you can actually get a better return off of a different economic model. So I think that there's huge potential in how that's all going to play out. It's going to be a exciting up and down ride. I'm absolutely positive of it, but everything's going in the right direction.
I think that's a great place for us to close our discussion today. We've been talking with Ben Taylor, CFO and Chief Strategy Officer at Exscientia. It has been a fascinating journey. I think lowering the cost of inputs, lowering the cost of bringing new science, new information to the table is an excellent sort of single line takeaway for all of our listeners. And I wanted to once again thank everyone for taking their time joining us, looking at an exciting new area of technology and application of AI that we find every investor is excited about, AI-enabled drug discovery. And we believe, as it sounded like as well from the discussion today, we're only starting to scratch a very, very interesting surface of possible opportunities and applications. I recommend anyone to Google the Boston Consulting Group study. I've seen that as well, and they're going to have to be continuing to refresh as that clinical data becomes available. But once again, thank you everyone for joining us today. You've been listening to The Next Big Thing, and Mobeen and I are going to keep bringing impactful, interesting guests to the table. So look forward to that next episode. Take care.